At first, there was a smell of incense, then hot meat. On the third day, the smell became so thick that even the guards, who were used to corpses, felt their eyes water. Those who passed by the Pope's chambers turned away, hiding their faces in their sleeves. But in the closed halls of the Holy Palace, it was impossible not to notice. Something alive was rotting under the pontiff's cassock, and the stench was so strong that the candles burned faster than they could be replaced. The internal records of the apostolic physicians, found in the archives decades later, began briefly: swelling of the feet, fever, ulcers. But after a few lines, the handwriting became uneven and the words more desperate. They described how the skin on the Holy Father's feet had a grey sheen, how his nails fell off on their own, and how a dark liquid with the smell of carrion accumulated between his toes. Doctors summoned from Bologna and Perugia performed bloodletting, rubbed his feet with an ointment made of vinegar, mercury, and ground laurel, and applied hot bricks. But the tissue continued to disintegrate. The doctors whispered about the plague, but in broad daylight, they claimed it was just a normal swelling from gout. It was too dangerous to utter a word that could spread panic throughout Europe. In the evenings, behind heavy velvet curtains in the papal chambers, quiet negotiations took place. The cardinals argued about who would be the first to announce the illness and who would be the next to sit on St. Peter's throne. The guards, who had received direct orders, did not let anyone in without the written permission of the Camerlengo. The servants who cared for the sick man later testified that the Pope often raved, saying that he saw black birds outside the window that cried in human language. Sometimes he asked to be taken to the main altar, but after a few minutes, he lost consciousness and began to wheeze as if he were drowning in his own saliva. The examination report, compiled by the Secretary of the Papal Chancellery, stated, "His Holiness's legs are a continuous mass of ulcers. The skin peels off when touched. His pulse is weak, but he remains conscious. Attempts to turn his body cause sharp pain and screams." The guards carried the bandages, soaked in pus and blood, out of the chambers at night so that none of the courtiers would see them. In the morning, new clean bandages, sprinkled with holy water, appeared in their place. The political situation in Rome was heating up. Heretical preachers in the northern lands were already spreading rumors that the Pope was being punished for the sins of the Church and would soon die, giving way to a new shepherd. At the same time, French and Spanish ambassadors were bribing cardinals in an effort to ensure the election of a successor favorable to them. Each day of the pontiff's illness meant new backroom deals, secret meetings, and nighttime letters sent through trusted monks. Paranoia grew. Every cup of wine and every spoonful of broth was checked in the chambers for fear of poison. But the Pope himself, who was now almost bedridden, looked at everyone with suspicion and did not eat until his servant had tasted the food first. In one of the manuscripts found in the monastery of Santa Maria del Popolo, a monk left the following note: "On the night of November 6th, I heard screams and the banging of furniture coming from the papal chambers. They say that His Holiness tried to get up to walk around, but fell at the first attempt, and the skin came off his feet like old cloth. After that, the Pope was transferred to a special bed with a metal frame so that his legs could be suspended when he was turned over without touching the fabric. Even in the cold halls, the smell of decay did not disappear. They tried to cover it with censers, but the thick smoke only intensified the suffocation. The rooms and corridors around the papal chambers were blocked off, and the maids who accidentally saw the doctor cutting off black flaps of skin with scissors were sent to distant convents. Rumors were already circulating in the streets of Rome that the Vatican was hiding the plague, and that it originated directly from the Holy See. This annoyed the cardinals. They feared that open admission of the disease would cause an uprising, and that keeping the truth hidden would lead to mutiny among their own guards. Towards evening, when the windows were covered with damp and the candles burned twice as fast as usual, the Pope demanded that penitential psalms be read to him. He listened to them, clutching the cross in his hands, and suddenly interrupted the reading to ask who was standing in the corner. But there was no one there. The doctors attributed this to fever and exhaustion, but the servants, leaving the hall, crossed themselves and hurried away. Thus passed the last weeks, in which the smell of death and gold, prayers and deals, holy water and pus mingled in one space. Rome did not yet know that the end of the pontiff would be not only a personal tragedy, but also the beginning of a new, far more dangerous struggle for power. But within the closed walls of the palace, everyone already sensed that this smell could not be dispelled by prayer, incense, or lies. In the second half of November, the disease progressed to a stage where doctors stopped arguing about the diagnosis. In the daily records of the Apostolic Infirmary, the clerk carefully wrote the word contagion for the first time, and this sheet was immediately hidden in the Camerlengo's personal chest. According to the servants, by this time, the pontiff's legs no longer had a clear shape. From the knees to the feet, they were covered with loose tissue, streaked with grey-black veins, from which a liquid oozed, leaving yellow and brown circles on the sheets. When the bandages were changed, pieces of dead tissue remained on the doctor's fingers, and they, unable to bear it, wiped their hands on the edges of their own clothes, then rubbed vinegar into their skin for a long time. Bloodletting was now performed daily, from the forearm, less often from the temple. The doctors explained that this removed the heat and bad blood, but after the procedures, the Pope himself became pale. His lips dried up, and his gaze was lost in a void. After several days of this, he stopped responding to his name and only opened his eyes at the word prayer. Servants working near his bed said that he began to breathe through his mouth, loudly, with a characteristic whistling sound, as if a viscous mass was accumulating in his throat. At night, when the most trusted monks were on duty, quiet sounds could be heard coming from the chambers, like drops falling on a stone floor. These were secretions from the wounds, flowing from the edge of the bed into a basin, which had to be changed several times a night. At the same time, anxiety was growing in Rome. Ambassadors from Florence and Milan behaved at receptions as if they were observers of a dying city. They smiled, but wrote secret letters home describing the pontiff's condition as irreversible. The Spaniards, on the contrary, behaved aggressively, bribing the guards and demanding access to the sick man to verify his health. People whom no one recognized appeared in the corridors of the Vatican, but they disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Each of the cardinals feared that it was during these days that his fate and the future of the entire church would be decided. On the evening of November 22nd, an incident occurred that was later recorded by one of the servants in the monastery chronicle. While his bandages were being changed, the pontiff suddenly raised his hand and grabbed the doctor by the wrist, whispering, "They are coming for me." His eyes were cloudy, his lips were trembling, and at that moment, A dark stream of liquid emerged from under the bandages on his right leg, splashing onto the floor in the doctor's clothes. A monk, standing nearby, cried out that this was a sign of God's wrath and ran out of the room. After that, access to the chambers was even more restricted. Now, not even all the cardinals could see His Holiness. Meanwhile, rumors of the plague, which had already seeped beyond the walls, reached the streets. In the markets, people said that the plague had started in the heart of Christianity and that it was a sign of the end of times. Some pilgrims turned back halfway to Rome, while others rushed to get into the city to see the sign and pray for the salvation of their souls. By order of the Camerlengo, the guards at the gates were reinforced, and everyone entering was checked to see where they had come from and with whom they had spoken in recent days. Quiet but fierce arguments were taking place in the Curia itself. One of the influential cardinals suggested sending the Pope's body to a distant monastery while he was still alive for treatment and prayers. Others called this an insult to the throne. Everyone understood that the death of His Holiness in full view of the court and the townspeople could cause a political earthquake. But even more frightening was the prospect that the disease would be officially recognized as the plague. This could destroy the authority of the Church in Europe. Every night, a rhythmic knocking could be heard in the chambers. The monks were beating small wooden boards to scare away the evil spirits from the body. The doctors tried new remedies, warm wine baths, rubbing crushed garlic into the skin, and salt and honey poultices, but none of them helped. In the mornings, when fog rolled in from the Tiber, the Pope lay with his eyes half closed, looking as if he were already halfway out of this world. However, the time had not yet come, and each new day in these halls was filled with the same things: the smell of decay, muffled prayers, and whispers about who would take the throne after his death. By the beginning of December, the smell from the papal chambers was impossible to hide, even with dozens of censers. The smoke, which at first had masked the stench, now only mingled with it, forming a heavy, acrid fog that settled on the hair and clothes of everyone who entered. The guards began to change every 2 hours because it was physically unbearable to stay in the hall any longer. The personal report of the physicians at the Apostolic Hospital, dated December 5th, states, "The decomposition of the tissues has reached the thigh. The smell of rotten flesh cannot be overcome by any means. The skin is peeling off in large patches. When touched, a black liquid oozes out." The same document mentions that when an attempt was made to lift the pontiff to change his clothes, he began to breathe heavily, his lips turned pale, and his eyes rolled back. The doctors decided not to move him unless absolutely necessary. Outwardly, the Pope was unrecognizable. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones were sharp, the skin on his neck was sagging, and when his eyes opened, they looked past people. He had almost stopped eating, taking only a few spoonfuls of a thick broth made from grain and wine. The opium they tried to put him to sleep with no longer worked. Instead, he fell into a restless, half-sleep state in which he muttered and tried to grab invisible objects with his hands. In the corridors of the Holy Palace, events were taking place that under other circumstances would have been called a coup. Cardinals, gathered in small rooms, held secret meetings without witnesses, and wrote coded letters to various parts of Europe. The French faction proposed immediately declaring the pontiff incapable of ruling and transferring power to the Camerlengo, while the Spanish faction wanted to wait for his death. and hold elections under the protection of their troops. The Italians, divided and suspicious of each other, tried to hold on to their positions closest to the throne. Access to the pontiff was limited to 3 people a day, and each visit was checked by guards. Even the senior cardinals waited at the doors for several hours, and more often their faces showed that they had come not for a blessing, but to make sure that the throne would soon be vacant. On the evening of December 7th, an incident occurred in the chambers. While being bandaged, the Pope's right foot fell off his shin, held in place only by rotten ligaments. Doctors quickly wrapped the stump in a cloth soaked in wine vinegar and carried the severed part away in a closed box. The guards were ordered not to tell anyone about this, but rumors had already spread by morning. At the same time, fear was growing outside the Vatican. The residents of Rome stopped approaching the palace gates, and pilgrims now kept their distance. Stories spread throughout the city that the Pope had died several days earlier, and that his body was being hidden in order to complete some important deals. These rumors were fueled by secret agents interested in destabilization, and they began to be mixed with predictions by street soothsayers about the end of Rome's power. Despite his complete exhaustion, the pontiff still tried to pray, but now his voice was quiet, with a hoarse wheeze with every breath. Sometimes he asked for the crucifix to be brought to him and held it to his chest for so long that the wooden cross left an imprint on his skin. In moments of brief clarity, he demanded that only one priest be present, one who is not afraid of the darkness. This turned out to be an elderly monk from Naples, who, according to the servants, read prayers against the plague over him and sprinkled holy water on his wounds until he collapsed from exhaustion. The worse his condition became, the faster the struggle for the future of the throne progressed. In the evenings, when the doors of the papal chambers were locked, a muffled hum of negotiations could be heard in the neighboring halls. Secretaries carried scrolls with seals, servants changed places among the main participants, and all this was accompanied by a constant fear that at any moment the death of the pontiff would disrupt the carefully laid plans. Meanwhile, in the neighboring rooms, the papal physicians continued their endless procedures. They lanced abscesses on his thighs, squeezed out dark clots, rubbed his body with an ointment made of ashes and vinegar, and applied red-hot iron rods to burn out the infection. These sessions caused the Pope to scream so loudly that the guards in the corridor involuntarily clenched their teeth. But death still did not come, which meant that the same cycle continued within these walls: decay, prayers, intrigue, and waiting for the moment when all the locks of the Vatican would be broken by news that no one could hide. By mid-December, it became impossible to keep the disease within the walls of the Holy Palace. The smell of rotting flesh seeped through the cracks in the doors and windows, penetrating the corridors and neighboring halls. The guards, standing guard at the papal chambers, began to cough, complain of headaches and fever. 2 of them were secretly taken out of the Vatican and sent to a hospital in Trastevere, but they died within a day. The news, though they tried to keep it secret, reached the city markets faster than it reached the cardinal's curia. The notes of one of the court scribes contain an entry dated December 12th. In the hall in front of His Holiness's bedroom, there are 2 copper basins with burning coals into which herbs are thrown. The smell is so acrid that it stings the eyes. But worse than that are the sounds coming from the chambers. A dull, gurgling sound, as if water were flowing from under the floor, and quiet moans that suddenly turn into screams. The doctors no longer pretended to know how to treat him. They performed procedures more to create the illusion of care. They washed the wounds with hot wine, poured vinegar over the pontiff's feet, and stitched up the places where the tissue had separated. But everything fell apart again. Now, the decay had reached the groin, and each bandage was accompanied by the loss of pieces of flesh that fell to the floor and stuck to the fabric of the servants' cloaks. At this time, the cardinals were already openly dividing up future positions. The Spanish and French groups behaved boldly, exchanging documents in front of witnesses and promising each other support if their candidate ascended to the throne. The Italians, weakened by internal strife, seized every opportunity, bribing guards to intercept their rivals' letters or taking the Pope's trusted servants away to try to find out what he was saying in his delirium. On the evening of December 15th, the situation spiraled out of control. One of the young doctors, unable to bear it any longer, rushed out of the chambers, shouting that the pontiff was dying of the plague. He was immediately detained by guards, but his cries were heard in the neighboring halls. By morning, rumors were spreading throughout the city that the throne itself was infected, and that anyone who entered the papal chambers would die. In response, the Camerlengo ordered all entrances to be barricaded except one and doubled the guard. Only 2 doctors and 1 monk now had access to the sick man, but this measure only increased the tension. The Curia began to suspect that the pontiff had already died and was now being hidden because his body was in such a state that it could not be shown. The servants who remained in the chambers later recounted that during those days, the Pope hardly spoke, only opening his eyes and staring at the ceiling. Sometimes he moved his lips as if praying, but no sound came out. Only occasionally did he utter words that no one dared to repeat. There was no color left in his face. His skin had turned waxy yellow, with gray spots in places, and his hair was matted with sweat. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the city began to prepare for the worst. Wealthy families took their children out of the city. Monasteries closed their gates, and shops raised the prices of salt, vinegar, and dried herbs, everything that was considered a protection against disease. People in long cloaks with hoods pulled over their heads appeared in the streets, selling amulets and whispering prayers for coins. In the Vatican, tensions reached a breaking point. On the night of December 18th, 19, 2 groups of guards, French and Spanish, clashed in one of the side corridors. The skirmish was short, but bloody. 2 men were wounded. This was the first clear sign that the struggle for the throne was about to come out of the shadows. Meanwhile, in the pontiff's chambers, the silence was broken only by the quiet footsteps of monks and the rare, labored breathing of the dying man. The disease had already defeated the body, but had not yet taken his life, and so each passing day within those walls became increasingly difficult, both for the man lying on the bed and for those waiting for his last breath.